Hey, thanks everybody for being here, and super excited to be here, of course, to talk about the topic of security operations in the cloud because it's an incredibly important topic these days. In fact, it's one of the most common questions I get, or at least categorically questions I get around operations and security in the cloud. Like, how do I adapt some of the things that I've been doing internally to try to gain visibility into the infrastructure, see what sorts of things are going on, be able to, of course, build and sort of piggyback things like detection and response capabilities around that. And when you move to the cloud, I think a lot of people, have sort of traditionally felt that, well, we don't have the same tooling, or we don't have some of the same capabilities that might afford us what we've traditionally worked towards in-house to gain that level of sort of control and response. And I think that's not the same case today. And so here it is, 2019, we're here, it's time to talk about this stuff. And so I'm really excited to be joined by the team at AWS Marketplace and really to be able to talk to you guys about what's going on out there and how you can hopefully change some of the things you've been doing and build a security visibility strategy for the cloud. So thus the topic du jour of the hour. Thanks again for joining us, and without further ado, let's get off these incredibly boring title slides and move on. So I'm Dave Shackleford, SANS Analyst, been around for a long time. I've actually been very heavily involved in some of the SANS Institute's curriculum in moving towards cloud-based security and technologies and controls. I've written a bunch of courses. I've actually, taught a bunch of classes there. I won't bore you with those details, but needless to say, I've been behind the scenes pushing for cloud for a very long time and continue to do so. And I'm excited to be joined by David Aiken. I'll be handing things off to him here shortly to give you guys a little bit more introduction to sort of what's going on within the AWS Marketplace and how some of those types of technology solutions can help you as you move towards building and adapting your security operations strategy to the cloud. Because let's face it, the cloud is happening, and the horse is out of the barn, so to speak. We're not going to be able to go back, and organizations have no desire to anyway. So there we go. That's the introduction. We're moving quickly to implement workloads. People are trying to get there. The hybrid architecture seems to be the one, so to speak. So you've got the ability to build wholly isolated architectures and infrastructure in the cloud if you want to. And so if you're like, hey, look, I'm just going to build stuff in the cloud and it's never going to talk to my on-premises infrastructure, so be it. That's fine. That's not really the normal case that we tend to see with most enterprises today, though. It tends to be more of a hybrid model where we're building that interconnectivity between cloud-based assets and on-premise assets. And what that means for us, of course, as security professionals, is that we've got to try to take our existing controls and adapt them. And naturally, that's the topic of the conversation for this webcast. We're looking at monitoring specifically and building this concept of really deeper visibility than I think a lot of people have realized we have. In fact, one of the most common myths that I come across, and I'm going to speak to these myths more in just a moment, so this is a little bit of a prelude. One of the most common myths that I encounter is this perception that we just can't get there. We just can't see what's really going on in the cloud once we deploy there. And there's this, I'll call it just concern. Right? I think concern is the right word. This concern that, hey, we're a little bit blind. We can't see what's happening. We don't have the same type of introspection and capabilities that we're used to. And that's just not the case. We actually do. Now, I will tell you that might require some different tooling and perhaps some different approaches than we've traditionally used, and that's okay. Things change. The cloud is a software-defined platform, and we have to adapt to that. But once you realize what it is you're working within, I think you're going to find that here it is. We're in 2019. There is a lot of different, just variety available to us in terms of what we can select and how we can approach this, both from the cloud native standpoint, so you can look to the cloud providers, certainly the mature ones, to be able to help you with this, as well as some third-party vendors that afford us those same capabilities in the cloud itself. So let's move on. Let's get into this stuff and have some fun talking about what's going on. And security visibility is just the starting point. So we're talking about the types of security visibility that you might have out there. And having been in this field for over 2 decades, I've seen such a shift in the approach that we're taking. I think we all started off a long time ago saying, we need logs. And of course that falls into the first category here, which is event-driven visibility. I need events. I need sort of finite, distinct event data that can feed back to me and tell me this thing happened, perhaps this is who did it, this is the time that they did it. I need to have some general sense of operations and applications and perhaps the users themselves, what it is they're up to and what they're doing. And so this is mostly about logs and getting log data within the cloud. That's really one big piece of this. But it's not the only piece, because what you'll find too is that we're dealing with this huge sort of infrastructure environment that has a whole lot more going on. There's not just user interactivity. There's system-to-system or object-to-object interactivity. So it could be an S3 bucket communicating with an EC2 instance, or it could be containers talking to various other storage types, or it could be even things like serverless functions communicating and orienteering here within the environment. Like, what does that mean? How do I sort of keep track of that over a longer term and have a sense of what's normal and what's not? Well, that brings us squarely to the second category, which is behavior-driven visibility. I need to have some sense of longer-term pictures here. In other words, Dave did this on this day, and consistently over a period of time, he logged in from a certain place, he performed certain activities, or, hey, this DevOps service account came in and performed certain activities, and this is the normal workflow that goes along with our pipeline, et cetera. How do I track that over time? How do I look at the big picture of 3 months, 6 months, a year, and say, what was normal? Where were there blips on the radar where things were sort of out of whack? When you're dealing with, terabytes, maybe even petabytes worth of data in terms of events, that can really be troubling and really challenging to do without having some tools and some capabilities within the environment you're operating within to be able to help you. And look, there's a lot of use cases here. There's insider abuse, there's account hijacking, there's, cloud resources being abused and misused or certainly attacked. I need to know all this stuff. I mean, think of all the cases that you would have internally for just tracking your users and what they're up to. None of that changes when you move into the cloud. Some of it's more application specific. So, hey, these users are trying to just talk to stuff that's running there. But it's also administrators. It's also the bigger picture of privileges that have been assigned to objects and assets. There's a lot of things going on, and we need to have some sense of what's going on in there. So this brings us into not a deep discussion about NIST. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about NIST and the cybersecurity framework in this discussion. This isn't really a compliance talk, but what I find is that most organizations need to align to some frameworks, and it's actually not a bad idea to look at a framework, especially one that's well adapted like NIST and the CSF there, to say, what is this doing for me? And there's a lot of different pieces of this framework that you need to be able to apply. The first category that we're going to be applying here, and by the way, we're not done, so we have some other pieces of this framework that we're going to be talking about too, but the first piece is right up front. It's that identification or identify aspect or category of the framework that starts us off. And so since this discussion is predominantly focused on visibility, ask yourself, what's the first type of visibility that you need? And I don't think it'll be a surprise for any of us to say it needs to be the assets themselves. It needs to be the systems, the containers, the storage nodes, the databases, the other pieces and parts, the users, the groups. All of those things are quote unquote assets, and I need to be able to have some visibility into what they are and how they're configured. And this has been a traditionally challenging area for security professionals. In fact, I think I've been saying this for, probably over 10 years consistently, that if you don't know what you have absolutely no hope whatsoever of adequately securing those assets. So you've got to have some visibility. into just what you've got running. And I think this is a place where, and in fact, I don't think, I know, that this is a place where the cloud affords us some potentially significant benefits. Because if you look at a traditional data center or set of data centers, especially if you're a large, sort of far-flung organization that's organizationally you're in Europe, you're in the U.S., you're in South America, you're in Asia Pacific, you're all over the place. You're in Australia, you're all over. How in the world do you possibly gain a centralized view of all the assets you have? And with the cloud, the good news for us is that there's a unified backplane in the environment that we can tap into and query to be able to gain that asset visibility. In other words, there's no way to hide in the cloud, is the way I put this. There's no possible way to, stash a system somewhere in the environment that doesn't show up on a network scan. There's no way to do that. So as long as we have visibility into the accounts themselves, we have enormous power to see what is in fact running in the environment. And there's just sort of so many variations of that we can look at. And I tried to list some of them here. I think some of them will probably be pretty obvious to you guys. But as with, anything new, you'll find that some of the things are changing pretty rapidly, and I'll get to that. But network visibility, sure, yeah, I need, network traffic. I need to be able to control that. I need to make sure people aren't trying to, send data that they shouldn't. I need to make sure there's no exfiltration scenarios, no network-based malware coming in. All the network visibility, whether it's firewalls or intrusion prevention or what have you, needs to be in place. I need application visibility, which has traditionally been one of the sticking points. I need to know what kind of app traffic is traversing my segments and networks, and I need to be able to potentially build profiles around that and say, hey, look, this is, normal applications versus this, this is not normal. I don't think these two systems should be communicating or attempt to, and so we need to be able to track that as well. Talking about things like containers or instances, those are the systems, those are the workloads that are going to be powering the applications themselves and communicating, but nonetheless they have OS variability and they have different elements that we need to get sort of down into. And so this is system aspects, and this is services that are running, and it's permissions and making sure that these things are patched. That's all visibility that we've got to have. We also have databases and major, sort of back-end storage infrastructure, albeit software defined in the cloud, but nonetheless still representative of the types of storage that we would normally need to dig into and drill down to say, hey, this is, this is the segment that we've been allocated, or this is the blob, or this is the, sort of S3 bucket, or this is the, relational database type that we've got, whatever the case is. I need to have some sense of the data types, what's in there, how to protect it, and, so forth. So sure, we need access controls around that, protect who's getting into it, also logging the types of access and the types of activities that are coming and going. Now, let me stop there for a second, because I think at this point, my guess is many of you are right there with me. You're like, yep, gotcha. These are all the kinds of things that we would normally need internally as well. Network app instances, databases, sure. Dave, we got you. Cool. Okay, I'm going to make that assumption. The piece that sort of peels us off into something new is in fact what we call the control plane, and that is arguably one of the most important concepts of security teams' efforts and focus for not only today but the foreseeable future, because it is a whole new realm that we've got to have some sort of introspection into. And what I mean by that is it's the environment itself. So if you guys decide to go deploy into AWS, what you have to take into account is that AWS is a software environment. It is an infrastructure that you can build on, and it has its own visibility and its own logging, mostly relative to APIs and API calls and API responses. But those API calls and responses are telling you all of the activity that's happening in your environment. I love this. I think this is probably one of the coolest things I've ever seen. Having spent over 20 years in the security industry, if somebody had said to me, Dave, one day there will be a switch in the data center where you can flip it and know everything, I would have laughed and said, that is ridiculous. There's surely no way to do that. But sure, there is actually. You can flip that switch because it's the AWS environment that is giving you that information, and you can flip the switch and tell yourself what's going on. So I love it, but you've got to have that. You need to know users that are interacting, services that are interacting, assets and objects that are interacting and communicating and trying to make changes, making queries, and all that stuff. It's all related, but it's a ton of data that security teams need to sort of wrangle and get their heads around as we start moving forward into more cloud-native types of infrastructure deployment. So what's different, right? What changes here? Well, I think I've alluded to that a little bit. I mean, you have this always-on integrated monitoring, which we've never had the ability to do before. So I think visibility is one of the coolest parts of cloud because you do have the capability to do things you've never done before. Speaking from somebody that has built data centers, built distributed data centers, and tried desperately to gain access to all the data telling me what's going on within those data centers, I've never felt that we had the capability to see everything, and certainly not even close to everything across the spectrum, as long as you guys have visibility into the accounts you run. Now look, if somebody sets up a rogue account and just does stuff, that's a little different. But if you have the knowledge and visibility into the accounts that are running, you can actually pretty much see everything. And that always-on integrated monitoring is one of the true benefits of shifting into a cloud orientation. There are myths. There are lots of negatives that continuously come up in the industry. And sort of being one of the true SANS cloud guys, I've been preaching this for a long time. I teach a lot of classes about cloud for SANS. I hear this just all the time, you know, like, we can't get the logging level that we need in the cloud. Well, yeah, you can. You know, there's absolutely no reason why you can't go click one button, turn on CloudTrail, send it to a bucket, and start knowing exactly what's happening. It's a matter of what you do with that data afterward. So getting the data is one thing. Using the data is another. You can most certainly get logging in the cloud that covers the entirety of everything that's happening there. And it's just a matter of you to build around, build a model around that. Network security visibility, that's a little more nuanced. So you talk about things like network security. Well, I think I'd go back and say, okay, let's break down what kinds of network security or network visibility you've traditionally had. And what you'll find is that in network security specifically, you know, it's not a valid point. You definitely can get capable visibility in the cloud, but very often what you'll need to do is adapt or adopt, I should say, a hybrid model, because the cloud providers have some, you know, sort of impetus to give you, hey, certain parts of that, but you'll probably need some third parties to help you to get certain types of maybe, you know, application-centric visibility or perhaps controls that you may need for regulations or compliance or what have you. So there's sort of a balance there. With logging, I can flip on some things and get everything I need most of the times. But with network security visibility, you're going to get some of it from the provider. And then what the providers have traditionally done is said, hey, we don't want to be network security providers per se. What we want to do is facilitate the network security providers you're used to using and give them the access needed to give you the additional data that you'll probably want to gather and use. So the cool thing is, back to the point, we have a unified backplane. The provider has sort of a software layer that everything talks to and communicates with. And if you know how to A, query that yourself, great. B, use the cloud native tools from the provider to get that data, also great. And number three, use some different services and solutions that have partnered with the providers to get in there. You're also, again, doing yourself a favor by getting into that. So there's lots of tools. There's lots of ways to do it. And the first step is really to sort of say, well, what do we need? You know, what types of event data do we have, and what kind of information is available to us? And as I've mentioned just a minute ago, the good news is pretty much everything you could want to know is right at your fingertips. You just have to turn on that capability. And within AWS, there's no better description of this than their CloudTrail logging service. It's actually one of the most innovative things I've seen in recent memory. Speaking from someone who's been a SOC analyst, someone who's done a lot of work in event management, I have a long history of ranting and getting on soapboxes about the deficiencies in the world of event management, how it's been such a struggle for all these years. If you told me, hey, Dave, come on in and like flip this switch and get everything you need, I love it. Oh my gosh, this is amazing. So I'm not saying this is always, the representative example. What you've got here is a pretty funny case of Dave obviously trying to come in and turn off his multi-factor authentication requirements, which hopefully fails abysmally, but nonetheless is logged whether or not it does. Look, you know everything. It is all APIs. You're dealing with a software-based environment. There's no more hardware. There's no more does this log or doesn't it. You turn this on, you know everything. And then you can record that into some sort of a central log store, and you just have to pull that out and do something with it. And that is where people are struggling is, going, I have all this data, now what do I do? How do I start adapting to that? And that takes some time. Is it worth your while to try to build it on your own? Or should you be looking at some third-party options that make the most sense? I think that's a subjective discussion, and I won't try to solve that problem for you or answer that question for you here. What I will say is this. If you're using vendors that you're comfortable with and you've built a relationship with and you have event collection and all that in place and you've got correlation rules and your SOC team is monitoring things, you probably need to ask yourself, what's the benefit of shifting gears and using somebody else? It's a complex question. I don't think it's always quite as cut and dry depending on the area of security that you're talking about. So if you're looking at systems management, well, there might be some benefits to just using cloud-native tools. If you're using, configuration tools or patching tools, there's so many different places where the evolution of cloud-native technology is making that easier. Hey, it might not make sense to just stick with a really expensive vendor when you've got stuff that's built right in, but particularly in the area of visibility and looking at things like event management, that is not a simple technology stack to implement. And in fact, you might find that having vendor products that you're already comfortable with, your team's already trained on, you've already built event progression scenarios around, blah, blah, blah. Look at those vendors and say, what is it that you can do for me within the cloud environment? Can I stick something in there to aggregate and collect data? Can it feed back to a centralized correlation strategy? Can I monitor that? Can I visualize it? And you'll probably find today that some of the leading vendors are pretty much right there with you. They're on top of things. They're pretty capable of integrating into the major cloud infrastructures. And they're also going to be pulling that data back and helping aggregate it at scale. And there's cost evaluation to do there. There's also just the capability set that you're looking for. While the cloud providers themselves are adding things, the vendors themselves might have been focused on this for a long time. So, don't be entirely, sort of negative about the vendor space when it comes to cloud, because some of them have really done a good job here. And I'd say that, it's not all cynicism. Some of them have really adapted well to the environment and can pull that data in. And that might, in fact, be the better option, especially for large teams that have already built a big-time process set around that. So if I'm looking at a modern SOC and how they're starting to adapt to become cloud aware, these are the major areas that I tend to focus on. And I won't dwell on this slide too long because I'm going to spend a few minutes on each of the major categorical sections and sort of speak to that. But, look, number one, you need to make sure you have things connected. Can I get the data I need? And can I aggregate that centrally or in a way that facilitates my ability to see things that are going on and then potentially escalate as needed to develop an incident response or threat hunting type of activity? So architecture planning is more about the tools, the connectivity, the scale, which is a big factor. In the cloud, things scale up, things scale down. It's much more dynamic. You need to be contextually aware of what's going on there, and sometimes the tools are good at this, sometimes they're not. That's one number of things that you should look at. The second piece is, of course, just your standard controls, and it's what's feeding into your event data and what you're interested in. So it's operating systems and what their posture is and the logging from them. It's the control plane, as I mentioned. If you're in AWS, hey, I really do want to know if I've got IAM users that don't meet the standards for password security, or if I've got groups that have been allocated privilege sets that they really shouldn't have been, or if I've got some sort of role assignments between services internally that aren't great, or what have you. So yeah, I want to know about the control plan. I want to know about this software environment that I'm actually operating in. I need to know about the entirety of identity and access management, which may go beyond what I just mentioned into things like directory services and users and their devices that they're accessing the environment through. It might be federation activity coming from a single sign-on portal or a provider. It's endpoint security, like malware detection. It's and network security, and which systems are trying to communicate with one another, and is that normal in the first place? And of course, as we've all sort of come to sort of know and love, it's vulnerabilities. So just because you deployed a system in the cloud doesn't make it safe. I know, shocker, right? So you spun up something from an AMI and you let it run for 6 months, and sure enough, it's got flaws and it needs patches, and you get it. So yeah, I need to know all those things. I keep up with it. And then the final piece, of course, is just adapting more of the process set. So when does something happen? What do I do about it? How do I validate it? How do I investigate and follow up? That's more of the follow-up incident response and forensics capability. And so, again, that's been one of the big sort of hurdles that people have struggled with, but you don't need to necessarily as much anymore. We've got much better guidance and tooling that can help us there. So let me start off with the beginning here, which is architecture. And I'd say if you're a SOC team that needs to build things into the cloud, you need to first off look at the connectivity. So if you're building a hybrid model, can I get a direct connect pipe that gives me a point-to-point establishment? Can I build things like IPsec tunnels that give me encrypted, dedicated connectivity between a gateway on my premises as well as my cloud environment? The answer, of course, is yes, but you need to know what those look like. You need to look at the tooling that's in place. In other words, what do you rely on? As a SOC team, what is it that you're expecting to feed back to perhaps an aggregate or central store? That might be endpoint security, it might be EDR, endpoint detection and response. It's probably some types of network events. It's a variety of intrusion prevention, access controls, all that stuff. Sure, yeah, what do I have there? I need to be able to maintain that appropriately. What are my deployment images and container builds? Where are they? What do they look like? And what is my plan for elasticity? And I always laugh about the elasticity point because it's not normal to us. If you looked in your data center right now, and right now you've got 100 systems, I'm just making up numbers. You got 100 systems, and I look 10 minutes from now and you got 200 systems, you would probably be pretty alarmed. Like, what the heck are these things? In the cloud, that's normal. You have auto-scaling that is built around capacity management. Well, does the SOC know about that? And if they don't, you've got an issue because we'll never really know what the assets are that are sending in data and that we're trying to communicate with and potentially aggregate and collect security events from. So you need to know, number one, what sort of elasticity or auto-scaling rules are in place. Number two, where they deploy. And number three, what sort of events they're actually creating and sending back to us. As long as you've got all that information, you can start building a profile around it, and that makes sense. But from a SOC perspective, that's a huge change to what we've traditionally been used to. Moving into the next piece, which is controls, I think this is probably, if I had to give you guys a Captain Obvious slide in this presentation, this might be it. You guys need to know all this stuff. It's all these different elements or aspects of what we've traditionally run in-house. It's the OS, it's the identity management, it's endpoints, networks, vulnerabilities, maybe threats, malware. Again, the big difference being that control plane side. I also just need to know, do I have admins logging into AWS and gaining access to their console? Why? Is there programmatic access coming through a DevOps pipeline that I don't expect? What should I see that service account doing? Those are things that should probably be built out and fleshed out more as use cases. And then finally, sort of adapting my processes. I'm talking about the SOC. I'm talking about visibility. Yeah, heck yeah, I got to know what's going on. I mean, if you've really worked to sort of stage that event triage to investigation to follow-up, which hopefully you have. I hope everybody on this call, hopefully everybody on this presentation feels pretty comfortable with what they've already got in-house. I can 100% guarantee you what you built doesn't accommodate for cloud 100%. Some of it probably does. The concepts do. I mean, an account hijack is an account hijack in theme anyway, but what's the ramification of that changes altogether. So you're in a different environment, you have different capabilities as an attacker, you have different event types. If I'm looking at CloudTrail logs, those don't have any equivalent to what you've been doing on premise with Cisco and Windows and Linux. It just doesn't match. I need to know what those things are. What are the events I need to know? How do I triage that? How do I go in and investigate and correlate the other activities that are there? When was the asset deployed? When was the user interacting? How did the user interact? Where did they come from? And then, of course, investigating. None of that's that different from what you might have traditionally been accustomed to, but we still got to really spend some time thinking through the changes and natural adaptation of cloud and sort of what it comes down to. And the one thing I'll recommend to you guys to help with that is, if you got a SOC team and you got an investigation crew, build out some time for them. In other words, let them adapt their tools. I sometimes call this in my SANS classes, I call it game days. And I think I even got this from a reInvent session a couple of years ago. So, kudos to the AWS brainiacs that came up with it. But it's a game day to say, look, you've been doing X, you need to do X, but differently. Well, adapt yourself, but you need time to do so. So if you're in management or if you're running these kinds of teams, maybe once a month or once a quarter at the minimum, give yourself at least part of the day to say, how would we do X if it happened in the cloud? And then build your process set around that. So just to wrap up, look, you can do this. I'm very positive on the visibility into the cloud. In fact, so much so that I've come around to saying you can have a better visibility or introspection in terms of what assets you've got and what their configuration are in cloud versus in data center in many cases. But you might not find that all of your tools work exactly the same. So look at the cloud native options, compare that to some of the third-party tooling and say, what's the best fit for the scenario? It's probably going to be a hybrid model based on my experience. Most organizations tend to find some of both really being beneficial. Coordinate your security ops. Those guys know what to do. They just need to adapt their tooling and processes to accommodate for access to the cloud. And that'll probably require some sort of API access, maybe a separate account. Things that we're going to be talking about in different sessions of this series with AWS, not necessarily this one, but that whole concept of giving these folks the right level of access as needed and building out the tooling to support that, it can't really be understated. So, make sure you're adapting and extending this to, your cloud environments. And this is really the critical aspect of cloud security overall, at least as far as visibility is concerned. So I'm going to wrap it up, and I'm going to hand it over to David from AWS. And thanks so much for your time, guys.
Hey, thanks, Dave. So let's check I can move the slides along. So my name is David Aiken. I'm a solutions architect at AWS, and I have a team of SAs spread out around the world who help customers implement solutions that use not only the AWS native services, but also partner offerings to kind of complement them. So I want to kind of apply some of the things Dave's been talking about into the services and some of the partner offerings that we have. So first of all, this diagram is giving you an idea of how some of the AWS services map across to something like the NIST framework. So strongly encourage you to go look at the NIST framework, the CSF, sorry. We have a great white paper on how AWS kind of maps to that, which is well worth a read. But let's start with, one of the key differences that Dave pointed out, which was, AWS is software driven. So we have APIs that do things. So if you want to create an S3 bucket or a EC2 instance, you're going to use some sort of API or some sort of software tool to be able to do that. And one of the great things about it being software, as they mentioned, is we can have a complete audit trail around that. And we have a service named AWS CloudTrail, which is on the diagram, there. And that logs gives you a complete log and an audit of everything that's gone on. It's going to include who called what from where, when did that happen. And using CloudTrail is going to give you all of the event history across activities such as someone in the AWS console, someone using the SDK or the CLI, or even other AWS services interacting with each other. So, when someone does create that S3 bucket, there's going to be a log entry. If someone creates an EC2 instance, there's going to be a log entry for that as well. So you've got this phenomenal insight into what's going on just in the bare bones infrastructure of your environment. Next up, we've got services like CloudWatch, which is a monitoring and management service that gives you kind of a view of the data and insights from logs and metrics and other events. We've got VPC flow logs, which gives you information about the network traffic going from interfaces on your VPC, and you can also publish that data into CloudWatch and Amazon S3 for later analysis. Now, one of the other, well, actually, pretty much all of the services have some ability to log not only events, but also metrics into CloudWatch. So between these two services, you've got a great set of insights into what's going on. And they're great examples of, event-driven sources. Something happens, there's a log entry. But we have also services such as Amazon Macy that uses machine learning to discover, classify, and protect sensitive data in AWS, such as PII or IP. And, that's currently being used by customers like Netflix and Autodesk to protect their data. We've got Amazon GuardDuty, which is a threat detection services that uses those very same logs from CloudTrail, VPC flow logs, DNS logs as some of the sources to try and detect threats. And again, using machine learning to spot, what's normal versus what's abnormal and what's out of kind of character. So these are providing kind of a more behavior-driven insights into what's going on across all of this log data. And, one of the challenges moving to cloud is, you ask for logs and it's like, sure, here's some logs. And then you end up with terabytes of log data to kind of go through and figure out, what's noise, what's related, what's important, what should I prioritize. So we've got a new service which is in preview right now by the name of AWS Security Hub, which brings together all of these logs and security alerts and compliance status across all your AWS accounts using all of the services that we've just mentioned, as well as third-party services as well. And Security Hub, new service, it's going to really help with 4 key challenges that we see from our customers who are moving workloads into AWS. First of all, it's going to help get that visibility and make sure that their AWS infrastructure can meet their compliance and other kind of security requirements, right? Next up, all of these logs have different data, different sources, different types of information. Security Hub's going to allow you to kind of bring those different data formats together and makes it easy to go analyze, what's going on across your fleet. The volume of alerts can be quite scary. One of the things you need to be able to do is kind of look at a VPC flow log with a CloudTrail and some CloudWatch metrics and figure out it's all part of the same event and you're just getting different pieces of data and different aspects to that. So Security Hub's going to help with that. And finally, just that single pane of glass view across security and compliance tools is going to be really, really helpful. So when you're looking at building your security visibility strategy on AWS, here's some of the tools, and we didn't talk about every one of them, but the next series we probably get to them. But these are some of the native AWS services that are really going to help you. Now, one of the powers of working in cloud and working in software is there's a tremendous partner ecosystem. In fact, Security Hub was designed not only to ingest and analyze AWS sources, but also pull in data and information from all of the partner security services that, maybe are new to cloud, but I'm sure most of you are looking at this slide and go, wow, I recognize most of these on here, right? You know, the F5s, Palo Altos, Trend Micro, just to name a couple on there. And what's great about something like Security Hub is it's going to bring in not only AWS data, but data from these partners to give you this kind of consolidated view. And what it's going to do is kind of help you aggregate findings, give you some tools and graphs and charts that are going to allow you to dig into, you know, what's going on. And you know, the amount of visibility that you can get, if we coin that, is just a little bit overwhelming sometimes. So, you know, Security Hub is just one tool that can help kind of bring all those things together. Now, we're going to talk about some of these partners and how some customers are doing this as well. But I've picked three out here which are particularly interesting to go dig into a little bit. And, you know, first of all, Marketplace is a digital software catalog that provides solutions that run on AWS. They include third-party options from vendors. We've got a couple of hundred security providers in Marketplace, a lot of which, as I've mentioned, you'll kind of recognize. And these third-party tools can help complement and extend the visibility and your ability to detect threats within AWS, as well as, you know, across on-premises environments. A lot of these vendors are consuming or generating both event and behavioral analysis around there. And I've picked out three here because, you know, they provide a lot of detailed integration with AWS, right? So you're probably wondering, you know, which of these solutions is going to work well on AWS. So, you know, Splunk, Alien Vault, Sumo Logic have all done a lot of work to not only understand AWS and the services and what's relevant, but also how customers are using AWS and what's actually important to those. And, you know, because they're great partners, they're also integrating with AWS services like GuardDuty and CloudWatch and Macie and Security Hub to help give this holistic view of, you know, everything from identity and access management to authentication to IDS, IPS, and just to name a few. So why don't we double click a little bit on, say, Splunk and look at some of the things they've done recently as a partnership with AWS and AWS Marketplace. So there's a couple of things that really stand out from Splunk. You know, Splunk operate software, their enterprise product runs both in AWS in your environment. So if you want to spin up the control plane for Splunk and completely manage everything about it, you can do that directly from Marketplace. But if you want to use their SaaS service where Splunk are actually operating the environment, you can do that as well. And Splunk's got integration with just about every service that's relevant in the security space, from ingesting logs through something like Kinesis to integrating with GuardDuty and Security Hub as well, which was, you know, Splunk was one of the launch partners at reInvent last year. They also have some great tools for monitoring and bringing in containers. So, you know, not only monitoring your container environment, but you can also run Splunk as a Docker image on ECS or EKS within AWS, and again through Marketplace. That makes it really easy to kind of deploy into your environment. And finally, you know, they've got a new product, Splunk Phantom, which is available in Marketplace again. And what this does is it provides a set of automation, orchestration, and response and kind of features so you can kind of react to security events. It has about 225 apps and 1,200 APIs that it integrates with. So, you know, it gives you a really, you know, full view and full integration with probably most of the products you use. In fact, you know, if we were to flip back to the previous slide to look at, you know, Palo Alto and Qualys, all of them have great integration points with Splunk. So let's take a look at a couple of customer examples here. And we'll start with, you know, since we're talking about Splunk, we'll talk about BrightEdge. So BrightEdge, for those that don't know, are a search engine optimization and content marketing performance company. They have about 1,500 plus global customers, and they have this SaaS platform that runs on AWS. So because it's marketing and so many customers around the world, security is pretty much paramount importance for them. The platform itself generated about $65 billion worth of revenue for its customers in 2016. So super important that they keep this up and running as part of that, right? So what are some of the threats that someone like BrightEdge would get? Well, it's the typical kind of list of suspects, right? It's software vulnerability exploitations, random or targeted DDoS attacks, malware infection, natural disaster, insider data theft or sabotage, right? Pretty standard set of concerns, I think, across most enterprises these days. Now, they do have a mix of vulnerability scanning, anti-malware tools, as well as some of their own software, but they rely on an incident response process to monitor the operations, detect problems, and respond quickly. And rather than waiting till the customer accounts a website problem or, spots that there's the things down because of a denial of service attack, BrightEdge actually uses Splunk running on AWS as a SaaS service for their security information and event management. Now, Splunk Cloud, as they call it, is a SaaS service, which means Splunk's operating that on AWS in an isolated environment dedicated to your specific customer needs. Now, what this does is it reduces the time and headcount you need to actually operate Splunk, right? You basically, you're going to sign up, you're going to log in, you're going to configure some access, and you're going to use, best practices for allowing Splunk to interrogate your logs and suck things in. But that's it. You can get going, usually within a few hours you can have something up and running. And one of the things they did was they did a comparison against some of the open source solutions and actually figured that in that particular situation, they would need another 2 headcount and probably around 5 custom apps to get the same level of functionality that Splunk was giving them out of the box. So what great kind of bit of data there for you. So this solution uses all the threat intelligence data from different sources, logs from infrastructure like AWS, the ones we talked about, as well as WAF and IPS, IDS, as well as business applications such as CRM. Alerts are then generated based on a risk score, and work tasks are created by Splunk automatically. So now you're not kind of trying to figure out, is this something we need to look at? You can use all of your data, all of your context to figure out, hey, Dave just logged in from Puerto Rico, which is bizarre because Dave's actually on holiday in Maui. Like, things like that can be automated and tickets cut and that kind of thing. Now, since deploying solutions, Splunk, there's a couple of things they've found out. First of all, Splunk actually helped them detect a whole bunch of intrusion attempts that they weren't particularly looking for, and help them identify the network vulnerability. It also helped detect malware infections on endpoint devices, as well as corporate data export policy violations. And a couple of big kind of killer features for them. First of all was the correlation of multiple data sources. So not only the infrastructure resources, but also application level and data from other sources, as well as integration with something like their CRM system and other cloud applications. And finally, because of this visibility and because of the automation and the queries that you can run, you can actually do some pretty interesting compliance reports. So it was one of the key enablers for helping them meet their ISO 27001 compliance there. Next up, we have Cello Play, which is based in Georgia. They actually decided to use Alien Vault. The company actually processes credit card payment information, collects and stores all that kind of thing. So obviously, pretty high target for the bad people in the world. And, their reputation and having a secure environment is really key to their business. They take advantage of running on AWS as well as the rich logs that they get. However, as they were growing, they figured they needed some sort of process and some sort of automation around looking at the logs and trying to spot when there were issues. And additionally, when they were running for PCI level 1 service provider, they needed a third-party solution to help. So they looked at Alienvont, again, another great product available from Marketplace. Took them about 90 minutes to get set up and running, again, because it's a SaaS platform. There's not a lot to do. You kind of spin it, you log in, set up some security, give it some access to your account, usually in a read-only fashion, and then within a few minutes it sucked everything in, and you start getting some really good insights into that. Alienvont also great customer service, so that was a key thing when Cello Play were looking at this. Great willingness to consider new features and add options to things as they were going along. And a couple of great things, again, pulling in logs from CloudTrail, CloudWatch, S3, ELB, and everything, and actually trying to analyze everything and produce some sort of meaning around that. Obviously, producing audit reports, another key kind of feature there, as well as being able to alert and accelerate their threat detection and response times. And then finally, we have Medidata. As it sounds, Medidata in the kind of healthcare space. They needed to make sure their security posture was in place and as a high enough level to stop and spot potential hackers and attacks, both on-premises systems and their systems in AWS. So they chose Sumo Logic, which has a cloud-native data analytics platform, gives them full visibility into the stack in a pretty real-time insights into their status of not only things running on AWS, but also things running on premises as well. And again, great insights, proactive resolution of security incidents, and just the ability to get that real-time look at what's going on and what's happening out of the unusual, out of the normal. So why Marketplace? So all of these vendors we've talked about, and a few hundred more in the security space, are available in Marketplace. One of the great things about Marketplace is it makes it really easy for you to go find some software and actually deploy it within AWS, right? A lot of our partners are really working out how their software runs really well in AWS across multiple availability zones, making sure it's a good, well-architected setup, so you're not introducing new problems by using vendors from Marketplace. We also have a great kind of flexible consumption model, so you can pay for software anywhere from free and bring your own licenses through to hourly licenses. So when you're thinking about scaling, you can use the hourly costs and things, but all the way up to annual contracts and longer term options there. And we also have SaaS options as well. So some of the vendors we mentioned there have both deploy yourself options as well as software as a service options. And finally, we actually have humans to help support you, which is always a good thing. We have a set of solutions architects and security advisors that can really help you kind of make sense of this, particularly if you have concerns about what types of things should you be doing. We have a team of people that can help with that. How do you get started? Well, we strongly encourage you to go take a look at Security Hub. As I mentioned, one of the great things is it can give you a view, even just turn on a few of the AWS logging things, and it's going to give you some great insights. But also, go check out some of the partner offerings that we have in there, and go talk to your AWS solutions architect about how some of the partners can help from Marketplace improve your security posture. And finally, I think just to summarize, I think building a cloud strategy for visibility is partly around do you understand all the different types of data that you and information that you have available. So, flow logs for network, DNS logs from Route 32, CloudTrail with all your API calls, right? You've got so many more options, as well as, some great partner feeds as well. Go take a look at those AWS services that we've mentioned, Inspector, GuardDuty, Macy, and things. Most of them have free tiers and free trials. You can try that out in a sandbox and, see what types of stuff you're getting. Obviously, look at your current tools, right? You might already be using tools that, the vendor's done the work to make it a good choice for AWS, right? The quick way to do that is go see if they're in Marketplace. Go see if they're on the AWS partner network site and if they have a competency within that area. And then finally, obviously, go try some new tools out, right? There's some great born in the cloud companies now that are doing tremendous things with both all of the logging as well as AI and machine learning to come up with new insights. And with that, I'm going to hand you back to Debbie for a couple of questions.
Thank you so much, Dave and David, for that great presentation. We do have a few questions. We have, what about multi-cloud environments? How does AWS services help enable security?
I suspect that's a great question for me on there. So this is David from AWS. It's an interesting kind of thing, right? So AWS provides a whole bunch of services for exposing logs from everything from API calls to DNS to, services that protect data and do threat detection and so on and so forth. And, we firmly believe in our first job is to make sure that our customers have the right tools to secure our platform, first and foremost. But, the reality is that a lot of customers are using hybrid environments, whether that's on premises or elsewhere. And this is where partner tools can help bridge those gaps between the different environments. And, particularly if you look at something like Splunk as an example, you can ingest logs from VMware, from your on-premises data centers, and bring that into the same kind of dashboards and get the same level of insights as you're doing with your AWS. So I think this is where partners really kind of help span those differences and the gaps there.
All righty, we do have another question. Network visibility has been really challenging to tackle for us. What are other organizations doing to improve network traffic control and monitoring?
Hey, this is Dave. I'll jump in and sort of start that off. And David, if you've got some thoughts and you want to chime in on it, please, by all means, do so. But I think this is sort of a big picture question. And looking at the spectrum of cloud and how it's changed, and particularly how network security has changed, I'd say what we're finding is that there's a balance, right? So there's really sort of two tiers of network security capabilities that people are looking into, one of which is, in my mind, almost wholly encompassed by some of the cloud native tooling, meaning if you want to go use things like network ACLs or security groups for controlling the access to resources at a fairly granular and low level and do so programmatically, you're really going to be in an awesome spot without having to go outside the environment itself. That's pretty easy. But as soon as you've got maybe an audit requirement or a best practice requirement or a regulatory need to move up into things like inline intrusion prevention or perhaps more advanced application profiling at that network layer, you might very much want to look at some of the partner types of products or third-party products that you've traditionally used, whether that's the Palo Altos or Fortinets or whoever the companies are. I certainly don't want to specify one or the other. There's a pretty broad variety in that spectrum, but they're still good at what they do, and as long as they've adapted into the cloud environments you're using, you're probably going to be in a better position. So the answer is really more of a hybrid solution. It's in fact what I found almost invariably happens with pretty much every enterprise out there.
Yeah, I would just echo some of that. Actually, the level of kind of, because it's software, you can actually define your network with all of your security controls on which ports, which subnets can communicate with which subnets, which instances, and so on. So out of the box, you can actually go create CloudFormation templates that wrap up all of those best practices and rules in there. But, as Dave mentioned, when you step up the stack, there's some great partners out there that actually complement what AWS does to give you that extra level of insight and control.